Kia ora and kaya. My name is Heidi Waldron and I am a member of AIPPEN's steering committee and your host for today's session, along with Nalini Panther and Megan Anakin. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that AIPPEN and ANZAPI pay respects to the traditional owners, custodians and knowledge holders of the lands and waters across Australia on which our members live and work, to the elders past, present and future. AIPPEN and ANZAPI also acknowledge Māori as tangata whenua and Te Tiriti o Waitangi partners in Aotearoa, New Zealand. A very warm welcome as you join us today. I invite you to introduce yourself and make any acknowledgements you feel are appropriate using the chat function of Zoom. Please add your first and last name visible on your tile, and if there are more than one person on each tile, please add both of your names. If you're an ANZAPI member, please add ANZ after your name. This helps us assign you to different groups. And if you're an AIPPEN member, please add IPE. I want to advise you that this event is being recorded. Please turn off your video if you wish. However, when you're in the breakout rooms, please turn your video back on because we won't be recording those sessions. I encourage you to use the chat to post comments and questions all throughout today's sessions, because the goal of today's networking series is to encourage conversations between people interested in IPE, to exchange ideas and to share practice. This series is an opportunity to meet colleagues in our conversation-based session, and it will be kick-started by our special guest today, Jill Thistlethwaite. We ask you to draw on your own experiences to make connections and to exchange ideas. Before I introduce Professor Thistlethwaite to start her session, which is titled How to Get Ahead in Publishing on All Things Interprofessional, I'd like to take the opportunity to briefly overview Jill's career. So Professor Jill Thistlethwaite is a highly accomplished, respected and globally recognised for her contributions to interprofessional education. After graduating from medical school in London, England, Jill became a general practitioner, worked for 10 years in the north of England and was involved in GP education. In 1996, she moved into academia at the University of Leeds and has subsequently worked in health professional education in the UK and Australia. She has a Masters of Medical Education from the University of Dundee and a PhD from the University of Maastricht. For over 25 years, she's been a champion for IPE and is a senior associate editor of the Journal of Interprofessional Care. She was editor-in-chief of The Clinical Teacher from 2014 to 2020, and her publications include 13 authored and edited books, over 30 book chapters, and 120 peer-reviewed papers, mainly focused on IPE. In 2020, Jill was awarded the President's Medal by the Association for the Study of Medical Education, and in 2022, the Pioneer Award by the National Centre for Interprofessional Practice and Education in the United States. We know that you will leave with at least one new idea to explore and widen your network of colleagues with interests in interprofessional education. It's now my delight to pass over to Jill to start this session.
Thank you for those kind words, and welcome everybody. This session is really flexible, and I'm really keen to see what people are saying in the chat and to answer questions. So if you do have questions as we go along, please do put them there, and hopefully I'll be able to cover them. But what I'm preparing to do is this outline. So to start with, just looking at what the difference is between research and evaluation in education, how to choose a journal, what makes a good paper, and what the field wants or needs at the present time. There's a lot of stuff I could say, so I will try and be succinct. I might deviate a little bit, but we'll see how we go. So one of the things I've noticed over my career, and I've been involved in lots of different journals in different ways as reviewer, editors, senior associate editors, etc., and also as an author, is that there is quite a bit of confusion as to what is the difference between research in education and evaluation. And I think in academia we notice this because there's this new idea of scholarship of teaching and learning, as if teaching and learning can't have its own research background. So I'm just going to start with a couple of slides about what educational research is, because this is important when you're thinking about where to place your work and how you define it. So we know research is about original work and gives a contribution. It's also something that must be applicable outside your study context, so outside your institutional context. And it must have a story that shows to your readers that your study is applicable elsewhere. And as you can see, there's a difference between rigor and novelty. But again, you know, even though pilot studies can be quite small, there often is a place for them in certain journals. Projects which are not research are routine quality assurance and evaluation, the results of assessments, so assessments of students, and educational needs assessments showing lack of knowledge. Those are all part of evaluation and are not necessarily of interest to a wider readership. So evaluation is not research, and there's just some things about what evaluation is. It's basically finding the value of something. And we obviously, as educators, are evaluating always. So this workshop's going to be evaluated. We ask students for their evaluations, but we wouldn't think of writing those up and sending them for someone else to read because they're just not that interesting outside our own context. But they are more likely to be of interest if they are talking about, and particularly within the interprofessional education world, if they're talking about something that's innovative. So some form of education or clinical-based practice that is new to the field. And that actually puts a lot of effort into the evaluation and is not simply asking students if they liked it. It has a theoretical background around that evaluation. And it's very important that it does acknowledge the limitations as being evaluation rather than research. So if anyone's got any questions, that's a very brief summary of that. And there is actually going to be an ANZAPPE workshop online in about 2 weeks, which is looking at educational research, which people might be interested in. But it's worth thinking about these things when you're choosing a journal to see if the journal is interested in evaluation of innovation. So people often ask me, how do you choose a journal? And you know, there's lots of things that impinge on your decision making. And I think one of the things, and I certainly find this with novices, novice academics, novice clinicians, that they don't really read that much outside their very narrow field. So they may only know 2 or 3 journals very well. So to know where to publish, you need to read journals, you need to look at them, you need to see their flavor, their style, what they're looking for, what they publish, and get the feel of how your work, whether it's in the early stages or coming towards completion, whether it will feel with the personality of that journal. And I think every journal has a personality and a flavor. So read some of the journals, see what they're publishing. The other thing, and again, this goes for novices and those of you who work with journals know that there is a global difficulty at the moment in finding good reviewers for publications. And we, you know, anyone who wants to write should also step up and be a reviewer. And being a reviewer for 1 or more journals also gives you a good flavor of what's happening, what's being published. You can see the other reviewers' comments. And it really just helps with your own writing. The other thing is always look at the author guidelines of the journal or journals that you're thinking of writing for. This will save you time later because you need to start writing your paper following the guidelines of a particular journal that you're actually going to submit to in the first instance. There's a few other points in there which I'll come on to in some of the slides. The other thing that, apart from the impact factor, which I'll define in a moment, which I think people get very hung up about, and certainly it can be a factor in promotion, CVs, etc. The other thing I think that's worth looking at in how to make this paper and then be waiting 3, 4, 5, 6 months to know what's happening to your paper, because you really shouldn't submit it anywhere else if it's already under consideration. And certainly the Journal of Interprofessional Care, and those of you who've submitted to it will know that in several years ago, the time to any kind of decision, even the first decision, was very long. So this is something to consider when you're choosing a journal. When is it likely for me to get a decision? And then also, when is it likely for this paper to be online? And this is just, I'll let you read this. Most of you will have heard of the journal impact factor and how everything in medicine, doesn't it? It has to be ranked. There's always ranking. So journals are ranked. And journals are ranked mostly by their impact factor. For those of you who belong in publishing, it's actually quite interesting because you can game this system. And the two most medical education, which also do publish other health professional education, are in this field, are academic medicine and medical education. And there's a gaming system going on here because if you alter the number of articles that you put on the bottom line of that equation, you can get your impact factor up. And so you don't count in certain things like commentaries. You just have certain papers. So it's a very, very difficult. It's a very difficult thing to get around. It's also not very useful, but we have to work within it because that's what the industry uses. And just to put things into context, so academic medicine with the highest impact factor in the field of health professional education has an impact factor of 8, whereas something like the Lancet within medicine itself has an impact factor of 168. So health professional education journals in general don't have very high impact factors. And so where you find all these metrics, you go onto the websites of the journals you're interested in looking at, and it will tell you these kind of things. So it will tell you impact factor. It will tell you how many days it takes to get a decision. It will tell you the acceptance rate. And you will get quite depressed because you'll see that most journals now have an acceptance rate of under 20%. And so, it is very hard to get published. There are lots and lots of papers submitted to journals every year, and only a small number will get published. The thing to remember is that if your first journal doesn't like you, it's really possible that another one will. And if it's been rejected after reviewers' feedback, do use that feedback to improve what you've written. So all of these, as you can see, there are lots and lots of information now on websites. It's very transparent. These are some other journals that publish interprofessional education and interprofessional practice research. And again, if you go onto their sites, you'll see their metrics. So there's quite a few journals that are specific to IPE, but a lot of the medical education journals, nursing journals, etc., will publish IPE, and that's becoming much more common in the last few years. Whoops, sorry. Types of articles, all sorts of things. You don't have to be restricted to research. If you just when I started in this game a long time ago, I just wanted to get my name out there. I mean, I started writing for GP newspapers and education journals, which were providing education. So, you know, just sometimes that whole thing about getting the first 1 or 2 papers really builds your confidence to move into bigger projects. It will get you involved in teams. Writing is a collaborative process. So there are different things that you can write, and these are some of them. Again, look at the journals, see what they accept, look at the different things they want in these categories, and don't send something to a journal that it doesn't usually publish, because that's the editor's just going to go, well, this doesn't fit. You know, person's obviously not read our journal. The clinical teacher has an interesting type of article called Innovation, Implementation and Implications, which is all about evaluation of education, which is a nice place to go with some of your evaluation. It's also recently had a call for accepting master's research projects. For those of you who are doing those, or you have students, it's always been quite difficult to get a master's project published in the past because they tend to be quite narrow. But this is a specific call out now for master's research projects. And then just quickly, the other thing that you might be interested in is whether you have to pay to publish, whether it's free, and the journal will tell you that. So the subscription models of journals has typically been that your library pays for these journals. The journals make money through libraries, through individual subscriptions, and therefore when you get published, you don't have to pay. The problem with that model has been that therefore all the papers that you publish are behind a firewall, which therefore means they're less likely to be seen by, you know, the globe. Now the subscription model journals also have contracts with university libraries that will allow you, if you belong to that's the university that has that contract, if you publish through your library and your university into these journals, your paper will be open access, and therefore you have a much better chance of your paper being read. Open access is also called pay to publish. Journals which are open access do still reject papers. They're not just for money. They have low acceptance rates as well. You don't pay until you get accepted. But some of these fees, you know, looking at something like $2,000 for many of these papers, which your institution may pay for, which you may have within your grants, but it is quite costly. One of the advantages of this, though, is that you own the copyright for everything you publish. You may want to look at how the papers are reviewed. They may be double-blinded so that neither the reviewer nor the authors know who the other person is. They may be single-blinded. The reviewers don't know who the author is, but the authors know the reviewers. And a lot of the open access journals are fully transparent. So Frontiers Group, for example, publishes there's a dialogue between the reviewers and the authors as the paper goes through the review process. BMC Medical Education, all the reviews are online. You can click on all the reviews and see the history of the paper as it went through. And then there's this model, MedEd Publish, which is part of the Association for Medical Education in Europe group, where a paper goes up and then you actually review it in vivo, if you like. So you can see the reviews going up as the paper's not reviewed before it's put online. So quite a bit there. Sorry, probably a bit quick, but it's all the sorts of things to think about when you're looking at writing. So now it's time to go into the breakout rooms. And what I'd like you to do is think about what makes a good paper. And that's not just a good paper in a theoretical sense, you know, a quality list of things that papers should have, but it's also what makes a good paper for editors. Editors want readers to read the journal, so they want good papers that are readable. So what are editors looking for? But then in a broader sense, what does our field of interprofessional education and collaborative practice need now? What are the questions that need answering in our projects and our publications?
So wonderful. We've got another 20 minutes or approximately 20 minutes where Jill's happy to either field questions or respond to comments that are in the chat. So please add your comments. Jill also has a number of other slides that may be relevant to the queries that are fielded, and we will aim to have this finished at 5 minutes to the hour to allow you to go to your next teaching or other commitments. So I'll hand back to Jill. Thank you.
Okay, so right. Just as a kind of a plug, and for those of you who are interested, and you may not know, there's two organizations globally, interprofessional.global and this interprofessional research.global, which are a group of scholars and practitioners around the world working in this space. And interprofessional research.global has a number of really good resources on its website, including this one that we wrote a few years ago, which looks at some of the questions about where we think we need to go with the research in our field at the moment, and what we came up with. And so this was a few years ago, pre-COVID. These were what we thought were research priorities for our field. So in innovation, building the scholarship, looking at different approaches that look at the complexity of interprofessional practice and education. And particularly, and this came up in the small group I was in, it's looking at the impact of what we do over and above, especially in research, over and above that satisfaction. And over and above, I would say also, I really do not need to see, and I'll say this carefully in case any of you are doing this, I really do not need to see a paper with an educational intervention that uses ripples to look for change. And ripples is a readiness for interprofessional learning scale from the 90s, which is still being used. So these small scale interventions in education that use a ripples before and after to see if people are prepared for interprofessional education. And my question to everybody when I see these is, well, we don't do that in nursing or medicine, so why do we need to do it in IPE? So we want more. We want to see what people are doing with what they learn. It is, and we know it's very difficult, but that's where we need to get to. Oh, someone's agreed with the ripples, yeah. So what I think is, and some of this we talked about in my group. So what editors and associate editors are looking for. So they want a clear message from a paper, all right? So these are clever people, and they're clever people who are writing. So you shouldn't have to read a paper more than at most twice before you understand what it's saying, okay? If you have to read it several times, the editor is not going to do that because they have a lot of reading to do. So it has to be, the message has to be clear, and it has to make meaningful contribution to the field. The obvious things about rigor, methodology, etc. It has to acknowledge the existing literature. Now, you can't reference loads and loads and loads and loads of stuff. You know, you can't do a full review before your paper. because you'll be limited to the number of references, but you have to pick up some really good papers. You have to show that you understand what's happened with the field. You have to know that the history of IPE goes back over 50, 60 years. It's not something that only happened 5 years ago. So some showing that you know the field and you know why you think there's a gap. Terminology, which again, I've got a comment here from Marianne. It doesn't help when authors don't use consistent terms themselves. Yeah, so defining the terms. We do have almost global consensus on the definition of IPE, though it does sometimes have slightly different wording. But you do need to define often interprofessional collaborative practice. You do have to define transprofessional, which we talked about in my group. So you know, if you're not sure, define. Particularly if you're using a word in your local context that might be different to globally, just say what you mean. And be consistent through the paper. So I often get papers that will use interprofessional education, multidisciplinary education, multidisciplinary teams, and just kind of seems to be suggesting they're all the same. So, oops, sorry. And I like to see in papers the implications. What are the practical? I'm a very practical person, and up until a few years ago, I was a practicing GP. I want to know what this means practically. What do I do with this? How do I use this information? How do I use it to improve what I do in my practice, in my teaching? Yeah, I agree. Lots of synonyms, and yes, the slides will be made available. So, you know, sometimes something's just not that interesting to read. And if I don't want to read it, then, you know, readers won't want to read it. And if readers don't read it, the publisher will say, well, no one's reading these. Because publishers like to see, and, you know, we have metrics for everything now, how many people start reading a paper, how many people get to the end. So some of these things I've already mentioned. And the major question I ask is, so what? I read a paper and I go, well, yes, so what? Okay. But you know, we'll still try to give you very constructive feedback on help you to improve. And you know that sometimes some of these things happen, and you could improve it. You know, but these are the things that really do make the editors and reviewers go, oh. And this is from the editor of Journal of Interprofessional Care, the current editor. These are why he rejects things. So yeah, there's nothing to do with interprofessional learning or practice in the paper. One-off atheoretical events which have not been sustained. Very country-specific focus, which is fine, and particularly if we see things from countries that aren't representative very often in the literature. So I like to see things from other countries who are doing really good work. But again, they still need to put it in the global context. So what we're doing in our country? What message does it have for the rest of you? Because we do know that most papers that are published still are from what we will call the global north. If you're doing research and usually evaluation as well, it is good to have some theoretical background to your work. And I haven't got time to go into this too much, but you know, it's really important. And this shows your scholarship and also shows how you're reading. And there are a lot of theories which can be applied to interprofessional education and practice. And so that's another thing to go looking at. And there's a lot of resources about theory. Interprofessional research.global's got resources, Interprofessional Global has, and many papers as well. And the main challenge, some of the main challenges in our field are that we need studies with more people across locations, across populations. We need things that look in the longer term. And I don't think this is just in interprofessional education. I think a lot of the health professional education itself doesn't look at long-term effects. And I will say medical education and the medical educators and people often look at IPE and say, well, you know, this isn't very good, but they're not actually proving in the long term that what they do makes much difference. So I think we need to follow up groups better. We need to see how learning is applied in practice. We need to show studies that indicate benefits for patients and communities. So that's in the area of education and interprofessional collaboration. And we really, really do need now to move into a situation where we're involving partners, both students, learners, and patients as partners in what we do, either as authors or acknowledgements or helping us to develop by looking at the questions they have. That whole patient voice is really something I'm quite passionate about. Where to start reading about IPE to build knowledge of the field? It depends where you're starting from. You know, some of the chapters in some of the education books, there's some really good books now about health professional education research. Going back to some of the old work, Hugh Barr's work, John Gilbert's work around the field. Then reading papers in journals and looking at some of the references and the references that keep coming up. Resources on the two websites I've mentioned. And just being open to reading about these things and following things up. It's a big field. Some of the newer things in relation to publishing, which I'm just going to mention without going into any detail, but these are things that are going to impinge on publication and writing. The whole use of preprints. So this is where you can put your article up on a preprint server before you submit it, or while it's being submitted before anyone else has seen it, and people may comment on it, and that's perfectly okay to do. It's worried editors because of plagiarism, but this is now an accepted face of publication. How do you reference ChatGPT is a big question. I think ChatGPT is great. I use it quite a lot to get an overview on things, and there are now many of the journals now will have a specific section on what you should do if part of your work is generated through AI. Some don't, and some it's very confusing. But you know, ChatGPT is here, and it's difficult to recognize sometimes. But you know, there are going to be ways to find out if people don't reference it. Beware of predatory publications. They're the people who write to you and say, oh, we just need another paper for our next issue. Would you like to present one? And you first start feeling, oh, great, that's good. But these are things that are out to make money. Paper mills, so people, the whole industry of papers being written by AI and groups of writers, and churning out stuff that really is very low value, but does manage to get published sometimes. The huge problem with fraud, not possibly so much in our field, but certainly coming through in the bigger medical and health professional field, the number of retractions, which you can go onto websites and you see these listed because of fraudulent or fraudulent conduct, plagiarism, etc. And also being really transparent if you think you have conflicts of interest. And someone's just referenced the foundations of health professional education research. There's also an ASME book, that's the Association for Medical Education, the UK version of ANZIPPE that's brought out a book about clinical education research, which is worth looking at as well. And I'm just going to finish with this. So when I read things and you go, oh, it's just not interesting to read. One of the things that makes papers difficult to read, which comes from some of us who've gone through this very scientific background at university, where everything is written in the passive and you can't say what you do. It's really, you can't say we did this. You have to say it was done. So, you know, I'm just reading things that are actually elegant to read. And my mantra is for writing is it's clear and it's elegant. So the content is clear and the writing is elegant. And I just really like this paper that came out very recently, which interviewed a number of voices in medical education. And about thinking about what is the distinctive voice and how you can make your things more readable. It was a nice paper. So I would certainly recommend that to people.
Wonderful. I want to, Jill's going to show a couple of slides that were mentioned of upcoming events that also build on the research themes. I want to say a really big thank you to Jill. I was incredibly inspired by the fact that you're able to take something that's actually quite stressful, being on the other side of the editor's responses, really demystifying, bringing it back to really actionable concepts about how to consider publishing your research, how to, well, I love the idea of writing with elegance and being very clear. And I also found it really useful being in the breakout room, and the purpose of these meetings is to actually build that collaboration between people, the networking, moving beyond a single site. And I'm always curious as to whether after these events people call someone else up and have either a virtual or a real coffee to consider whether or not they can take either their research or their projects that next step further with other colleagues at different institutions. I'm sure that many of you have felt very encouraged by hearing Jill talk about many of these concepts from a very extensive career in this publishing space, both publishing, reviewing, and really supporting people in this journey. I'd also, in addition to thanking Jill, like to thank the facilitators in the breakout rooms, Kendall, who always does a fabulous job supporting us to deliver these networking events, and to each and every one of you for joining us. I have put an evaluation link in the chat. It's a Google form. It's a very quick form that just allows you to answer a couple of quick questions about activities you'd like to see in the future. And I would also encourage you that if you are able to go to the ANZIPPE conference that will be held in Adelaide later this year, to please remember and go up and say hello to other people that you meet at these networking sessions, including people like Jill Thistlethwaite. So I'd like to say thank you and goodbye to you all.